and then about work that we've been doing to assess the state of data, land data specifically, across country level, and the work that we're doing to scale that up into a sort of a global indicator on data accessibility and data openness. But we're also currently doing some work in Mozambique. Work is not yet complete. So maybe with that, and by way of introduction, I'd like to invite Marie up here to just tell us a little bit about what is happening in Mozambique with regards to data on land and what they are doing in Mozambique at the moment. So welcome.
Thank you. So I'm Maria Young. I'm from Mozambique. I work for Terrafilm. So I will talk a bit about how the data stage access is in Mozambique. I will start by giving you an overall information about how roles are very, how can I say, upfront and talk about this data sharing and data collecting. In Mozambique, the constitution already talk about sharing data. It's a constitutional right to have information about what is the stage of the data, not only the land data, but all the data concerns of population, concerns of other types of use of land. Of land. So besides the constitution, we also have decrees that they talk about, for instance, how this data should be collected, how this data should be shared among different institutions of government. There is also another decree that was put in place that talks about the right of the right to access this data, because we have it's very difficult to access data. You can, even if you're doing a research, you go to a ministry or a national agency or somewhere else, you ask for information and no one gives you the information. So there is this degree, but even with this degree, you write a letter to ask to access this data, they will receive your letter, they will say that they will get back to you in 30 days maybe, but they never get back to you. So it's very, very difficult to get information, especially accurate information. Okay. So one of the things in Mozambique is that the land belongs to the state. So what you get is the right to use and profit this land, but the land belongs to the state. And the state has to establish a national land cadastre. This national land cadastre is not only about land. It should be include all types of uses. I mean, fisheries, mines, forestry, everything. But all these institutions, they have to create their own cadastre and then send all this data to one institution that will establish the land cadastre. But unfortunately, not even the small institutions, they have ways of creating database and systems to have all the information. For instance, for the land sector, they established a system that because Mozambique, let me give you like a big picture of the boundaries. It's like you have the country and then you have provinces and then you have districts. These systems established on the province level. So all the districts have to send data to the province level. But this database is not connected to the national level. So there's interoperability between the databases. And they also need, beside this interoperability, they work in different ways. You can find one using open source software. The one is using a software that needs a license, and there is no this connection between the database, and that makes more difficult for them to have all the information together in one place. So if you go to the national level at this moment, and you ask them how many communities do we have limited, they can give you a number, but they can't show you. Even the number they will say maybe, because it's not them who are doing the community delimitation. What happens is that the NGOs or private companies and also the individual parcels delimitation. And because their system is not working, people that are doing the delimitation are keeping the data with them until they have a system that works, so then they can send it and have everything together in one database. So the effort of having systems that collect information and shares it with everyone, it comes mostly from NGOs and private sector companies. The other thing is that the land law and the forest law
Sorry.
are currently on revision right now. And that, for me, raises a big concerns, because how can you be revising something without having a full picture of what is happening? How can you assure that this review will bring inclusivity, will bring a better use of natural resources if you don't have a bigger picture of what is happening? So this is why, not now, but a while, for maybe 5 years now, Terrafilm, the company that I work for, has been thinking about this. Like, everyone has data, but where is this data? So we started gathering all information that it was possible. So we started by talking with the government, because we thought that it would be good for them to be part of this, because you can do it, it's public information, but we want them also to be part of this process, because a lot of the information actually is with them as well. They don't, it's spread, but it's with them. So we give them tablets. We establish a database where they can take a picture and send us information about the communities that are delineated. We also did this with NGOs, asking people if you have shape files, if you have any data related to forest concessions, related to land delimitations, send us, and we will see how we can work out all this data. And we end up establishing a portal, a portal, that is, we are still working on it. And we were finally able to sign an MOU with the government, like it's been a couple of weeks ago, that we signed the MOU with the government to put this geoportal out and share all the data that we have with people. We were able to collect more than 2,000 parcels, community land areas that we delimited, and we also have the documentations related to those communities. And we think that this portal will be very important, not also for the communities, because we have a lot of communities that were already delimited. But when you go there and ask them, will you delimit it? They will say yes. Can you show us a paper? Because when the community is delimited, they receive a certificate. Can you show us a certificate? No, we don't have a certificate, because it takes time for the government to issue the certificate. It can take 30 to 60 days, or maybe even more if you don't follow up, even more. And sometimes they don't even give the certificate to the communities. And because a lot of NGOs that are doing the delimitation, they rely on the donors' money, and it's a certain period of time. When that period ends, they don't follow up. So you get communities that were delimited, but they don't have a certificate. And when a different NGO comes, they will say, no, we were not delimited because we don't have a paper, but they were delimited. So in this portal, it will be easy for anyone just to go there and visualize everything, not only about the communities that were delimited, what is within this community in terms of natural resource, the documents that this community has related to the delimitation, population, because we are also overlapping information about population. So private companies, donors, anyone who want to plan an activity within this community can have more insights to produce a better plan, to know where it's going and what to do. So basically, this is what I have to share with you. And thank you.
Thank you very much. Unless there are urgent questions, I think we can open the discussion at the end. But I think what she's just presented highlights some of the challenges, the problems, but also the opportunities in a very practical way that kind of motivated the work that we started doing on documenting the data ecosystem. So I work for the Land Portal Foundation, and we're an advocate for open land data, but we see land data as driving progress, improving access as not only a right in and of itself, but as a foundation for enabling and the achievement of other rights. But we also seek to engage stakeholders in this process and develop supporting actions to not only advocate for opening up of information about land, but also to build capacity around that. And I think the situation that we are facing is that there's poorly managed data, often available, often localized, but it is inaccessible. It is not seen. And I can take a bet that if anyone Googles now information on Mozambique, will most likely first be directed to a World Bank website or data resource, etc. And we have very little information by the country, on the country, often that is visible. This is partly the way the information is structured on the internet, how interoperable and open and accessible it is. And so I think for us, the challenge is to engage at country level to say, what can you do to make your information that you need for the services that you provide more available, more accessible? And you can read more about the Land Portal. But I do want to stress, and we've had this discussion over the last couple of days on sort of human rights framework and land in that context. And we often forget that information is a fundamental right in and of itself, but it's also a key enabler of other rights. The SDGs have access to information as a core issue, I think 16.10.2. The African Charter specifically talks about access to information as one of its fundamental rights. And to strengthen that, the AU has gone as far as to draft a model law on access to information that countries can use to guide themselves to adopt as a legal framework for protecting access to information. And then the reason I emphasize this is because often in discussions, access to information is presented as a luxury, a nice to have, something that is additional to but not core, because people are talking about access to water, to sanitation, to nutrition, and information is somehow a more esoteric right that comes later and afterwards. And I want to turn that around, that if you're talking about access to water or sanitation or nutrition, you need to start with access to information. That is the starting point. And I think it's also important for us to remember that access to information in and of itself is not really the goal, it's the means to an end. But it's about using that information to then provide access to services. And in our context, we are talking about services to land. But I think it's instructive to look at the AU level, for example, in Africa, and realize at the highest levels that access to information is a fundamental right and is a very important issue. And we'll look at some results a little bit later. So the Land Portal has developed a number of tools to track the state of land information. What we're talking about now is the SOLI Index. We want to measure the openness of land data. We want to do this in a way that is globally comparable. And it's derived from the work that we do, which is called the State of Land Information, but it was a more narrative and descriptive assessment at national level, at countries. And we realized we needed to scale up this work. We've piloted about 17 countries, but we realized we need to make these findings more actionable. And that's part of the rationale for the development of an index that is benchmarked, that countries can use as a baseline and as a diagnostic. And then the third level that we work at is to use this diagnostic to then engage at country level to support actions to open up information. And that we developed a soft tool called the Open Up Guide that can be used by countries, but can also be used by organizations. It talks about standards, etc. Please feel free to join us. No problem. So we've kind of compared and mapped the SOLI index, which is work that we've already developed with the global data barometer called the LAND module. And we see this not as duplication, but really as an effort to complement existing initiatives that exist on monitoring data, tracking the state of data. So we're talking about the SDG tracker, we're talking about GLI, Landex, Prindex, but they all have their role and they all play a slightly different function. And we are also in discussions actually with Landex, how to feed this into the Landex data set and in the GDP. But we also see this as a means for driving discourse about land and about data and information. And it's important because when we speak about data, even though we like to say that data itself is neutral, the organizations, the people that deploy the data are not neutral. They have political agendas. So when we talk about data, we have to talk about ethics, we have to talk about justice, and we have to talk about inclusion. But we've also framed this in the context of land data. So we've derived it from the land administrative functions, because we said, okay, what are the services that we need to deliver in land? And so we say, okay, this is the framework for land administration for sustainable development. Those are the services that governments need to render. Let's use that as the basis for defining what is land data and what is the type of categories for land data. So you could say the SOLI index is guided by these sort of three conceptual frameworks more broadly. One is the theory on land administration. What that is, it's an existing theory, been adopted by the UN, FAIRLA, etc. And then we have open data. This is the open data community. What qualifies as open? What does open mean? How do we understand open? So this is criteria such as interoperability. Is the data machine readable? And so we use this to define the categories of land data and then also the criteria for openness. So we are not interested in assessing the spatial accuracy of the data or the precision of the data or the resolution of the data, but we are interested in assessing how open that data is, how available is it, how easy is it for a citizen to access the data, or do you need to register on a platform, do you need to pay a fee? So we use that kind of approach, and then this is anchored in kind of a human rights framework for developing indicators. I think there was also a little bit of talk about that yesterday. So the process that we go through can really be described, I don't like to use phase 1 and phase 2, but it does serve a purpose for demonstrating the flow of our methodology. So the first step is really to understand how much public sector information is available, and then to assess how open that information is, and finally provide a globally comparable indicator for openness. When we engage with governments, we often, and not only governments, many organizations say, no, we make our data openly available. And when you interrogate that, they publish it to their website, but it's a PDF report. And all the graphs and all the tables are embedded within that PDF. And we say, okay, that's public, but it's not really open. And so it's also about developing this understanding of what open means from a technical perspective, not just public. And when we start examining government policies, you start seeing there's a strong foundation in law, in policy, for sharing and making information accessible, but it is often not fully implemented and understood in that way. Also, to make sure that our process is as transparent as possible, so we focus on the databases that are, for which government are the custodians. So, we don't look at the World Bank or WRI or these other organizations. We look at government. What data do they have that they make available for citizens to use? And we document that data so that when we do the assessment, all the data resources that have been assessed are also available for public scrutiny. And we see that as a process where the data sets can be updated. New data that comes online can be reported there. And we hope that this is going to be some measure of engagement. And we document that. And then we score the data according to these 10 criteria for how open it is. And I think we will keep all these processes, very public. I think most people won't really dig into it, but if you want to, you can. So we've identified the 4 core data categories, which are tenure data, land use data, land value data, and land development data. Of course, not everything applies in every country. We heard from Mozambique, there's not a formal land market per se, because all land is owned by the state, but assets related to land are still bought and sold and traded. So there are still measures for land market. Also, you look at budget information. Are the budgets made public? Are they online? So how much money is being spent on land development functions, or how much money is derived from land development functions? Once again, I'm not interested in the amount itself. We're interested in whether that information is publicly available and accessible. And then we look at the open data criteria, of which we have 10. The first one seems obvious, but it's an important distinction. Is the data online? We find in many cases data exists in countries, but it's closed. It's on systems, it's on hard drives, it's on intranets, but it's not online. Is it accessible, free, timely? Is there complete metadata? Are appropriate standards used? Is the data downloadable in bulk? Do they use APIs? Is there license information? How machine readable is it? And do they use URIs? And you can see this as sort of levels of sophistication in terms of openness, because it's not a binary. And then in terms of the data governance, we start with looking at sort of international instruments like the African Charter, look at countries that have they ratified that, and then you look at the national commitment. So is there an ATI law? Is there a data protection law? Is there mention of access to information in the land data and legislation, and operational practices and procedures between government ministries for swapping and exchanging and transferring data? And we score this either yes, it's fully open, or it's partially open, or it's only a little open, or no, it's not open at all. And then this will be computed and weighted, and the final score will be derived. In terms of the types of indicators that we have, governance is a structural indicator looking at the governance of data. Then we have the openness of data, which is an outcome indicator. And we're also borrowing a module on capabilities, which is a process indicator from the GDP, to try and give a complete picture about what is the legal framework with regards to openness, what is the outcome with regards to openness, and what are the capabilities with regards to opening up data within the government sector. So we ask ourselves 4 key questions. What is the indicator? It's an indicator that assesses the openness of land data. And we want to do this globally. Why? We think that land data in the public domain is very important. It enables use, ensures transparency, and can improve decision-making. I've already spoken about our methodology, and we think this is an important diagnostic tool for policymakers, for land data custodians, for researchers, for practitioners. And it's also a way of making these country narratives that we developed more actionable, more implementable. These are the key questions that we ask. So how much data is online? And we ask that question about every category of data. And so, for example, for land tenure data, we're not only looking at the cadastre, we're also looking at communal lands. So is there a communal land register? Is that data recorded? Is it accessible? Is it available in indigenous lands where that may be applicable? So we have a number of questions like that, and also asking questions about whether that data is, if it exists, if it's gender disaggregated, you know, if you have access to those information. So we want to develop an element around this sort of inclusiveness of the data and not lose that as well. We hope that at the end of the day, we can have a number of points of entry into interrogating the data. So you have a big picture global score that you can use for your lobbying and advocacy to say, globally land data scores 40 for openness. Whatever that means, it's easy to understand. But if you really want to dig down, you can say, well, I want to look at Mozambique. How open is land data in Mozambique? So the score is the starting point, but then you can use that score to look at the types of land data in Mozambique. that are open. Some types might be more open than others or less open. Or you can also look at the open criteria and see, well, a lot of data is online, but it's all in PDFs. So you can actually then come up with some interventions to not only make the data publicly available, but to improve the technical characteristics of the data, to improve its interoperability, its reuse, the issues that you mentioned. And I think this can tell us, number one, about openness, but also about an organization's capabilities to open data. And then I think most importantly, being able to identify some obstacles to openness that can become actions to rally around or to engage in at country level. We've mapped against Landex. I'm not going to go into the detail of the mapping, but one of the issues that came up that we were missing in our initial drafts was some aspects of the sort of inclusivity, which we have since included. There's also some other aspects that we are not going to include. These are around whistleblower protections and tolerance for corruption, because we do think that it's important to maintain kind of the thematic integrity of the indicator and not include everything that is important that we want to know about, but also keep the relevance of the indicator. And Transparency International is working on a corruption indicator, so there's no need to kind of duplicate that. We're also having conversations with them to make sure that we don't overlap, but that we complement. We also mapped against the GDP. Once again, I'm not going to go into the mapping, but I think it's to demonstrate that we are really seeking to complement the knowledge and the indicators that are out there rather than to redo the work. So what are the key elements that need to be considered? I think it's important that we make sure that we explicitly include these elements of data justice, data equity, and inclusion. There was also a strong issue around climate change, but we decided against including climate change data in the indicator because it becomes so broad, and we see land data as one of the inputs for mitigating climate change rather than trying to measure that in here as well, because then your measurement becomes so broad that it also then becomes a little bit meaningless. And we are hoping to implement sort of pilot by the end of this year, maybe launch that early next year for about 17 countries by the end of this year. And then we want to scale up to collect data for 100 plus countries. 100 sounds like a good enough number to say it's global. So 100 plus countries. And then we are working on partnerships. So we're part of the EC Data Alliance. It includes the Land Matrix, Prindex, Landex, us, talking to FAO, GDB, the Global Data Barometer. So we're also really trying to build a broad alliance around the use and the uptake of the indicator, which is going quite well so far. So what are the preliminary results? And this is not a detailed analysis, but I thought it might be interesting for the countries where we've completed work, although it's still ongoing, just to share some preliminary findings. And we see that in 2001, one country out of 54 in Africa had an access to information law. And I don't want to say it's because of the model law on access to information that the African Union drafted, but I think it certainly plays a role. We are now at more than 50% of countries in Africa have adopted an access to information law, which I think is pretty significant. And another 8 countries have legislation pending. That would put us on 65% of African countries having legislation or in the process of introducing legislation to access information, which I think sends a strong signal that this is not a luxury issue. This is a fundamental issue for governments to tackle. My presentation is a little bit Afrocentric because that is where the pilot countries are, but that will also change when we scale out globally. Another 36 countries have data protection legislation. So there is a lot of emphasis, obviously, on privacy, on security. There's a lot of concern around that. And I think that is normal and completely understandable. What we have seen is that countries where legislation on access to information exists tend to have better results with regards to opening. Now, that shouldn't be a surprise because the legislation provides that kind of framework, although it is not sort of a linear response. So some countries have just approved an act, and there's some countries like Namibia that only adopted an act at the end of last year, but they have a strong spatial data infrastructure policy. And long before that, an Access to Information Act, access to information in the land sector was considered a given, because the old land legislation says that all land records have to be in the public domain. So even though there wasn't an ATI law, a lot of progress had already been made. So we also see this leadership, I think, is important not only for countries, but other for Pan-African institutions like the Development Bank, who's also adopted an access to information, open access to information policy, open by default. And in their rationale for adopting this policy, they listed 7 reasons, 5 of which were about the internal fulfillment of the bank's mission. Because often access to information is painted as some sort of service that you do for an external audience, for other people to benefit from your work. But it's not. It's really for you to finish and complete your core mission. You need to make information more interoperable, more accessible. So I think that's just an interesting point to take note of as well. Some of the results that we see, I hope the graph is clear. So the blue and the green is other land data, and the purple, I should say, not blue, purple is legal and policy data. Those are the data categories that we find are the most open. So unsurprisingly, many countries have quite well developed sort of legal databases where you can find the policies, and that is all obviously very important. But when it comes to land tenure data, there's very little available. When it comes to land development data, there's very little that is actually available. Of course, it's also distributed because some of the development data and applications for development and enforcement issues are dealt at municipal or local authority level, not necessarily at central government level. And we find that at local authority level, capacity tends to decrease the further you go down away from the national government. But it is instructive that some progress has already been made, and we can see the areas that need improvement, and we can work on that. Land value data is also not particularly open, but it's interesting that I think, number one, more data is available than countries often think. When we go in, the first response is, no, we don't have any data. It doesn't exist. When you start interrogating and understanding that, countries usually find out that they have more data than they know about. Within government, even, we had a workshop in Senegal, and it was quite funny because one of the government departments approached the director in the meeting and said, but how can you share this at the meeting? And we never knew about this, that you have this data. So when you start having this discussion on access to information, it starts opening some of the doors between government departments that are very siloed and often redo what other departments are doing. So everybody's doing their own data collection efforts, and that is very expensive. It's not very efficient. It's not very effective. But even though there is data, it's fragmented, it's unstructured, it's poorly documented, it's unknown, it's not known about, it's not open, but it's public in various ways. And then the other line that we hear often is that we have no capacity. There's no technical capacity. When you start looking a bit closer, it might be true to some degree, but there's often a lot more capacity. But it's about allowing technical staff the freedom to innovate, to implement, to do what they need to do, and to give them the resources to do that. So we have accounted, I think, also in civil society, quite strong open data communities that exist in these countries, advocates for open data. So there's a lot that is happening, but it's a little bit invisible to each other. And I think through this process, we are also forcing a conversation a little bit more to happen at the national level. Please don't quote me on these results, but the preliminary results, so as I said, please don't quote me. She takes a picture to have a record. But no, please go ahead. Please go ahead. No, don't worry. Not a problem. So we see South Africa, obviously, that started very early with an ATI law, probably have the best results. But we also saw at the presentation yesterday, South Africa's progress is actually slowing down. They're not doing as well as they used to, and other countries are catching up. And Namibia and Zambia were two countries that performed relatively well, but didn't have an ATI law. Zambia still doesn't have an ATI law, and Namibia had an ATI law. I think it was gazetted like on the 23rd of December last year, so it's a very recent law. Countries that are not doing so well, perhaps not unsurprisingly, South Sudan. But once again, the purpose of this is not to rank the countries really against each other, but to take that as a diagnostic and say, okay, where can we improve? So for example, in South Sudan, a lot of policy documents were available, are open. So you still have a foundation from which to work. And it's really about, I think, engaging in this process, but then it's also important to have a benchmark and a global benchmark so that we have a good framework for comparison. So, yeah, not too bad. Thank you for listening. Thank you for giving your time. And I think we'll both take questions now that you might have, or any comments that you might have. Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. It's a nice presentation. What becoming my question is, sometimes I'm struggling when doing the open data assessment because there are a lot of conditions, yes but no. Like in the Netherlands, if you ask about is it free? Yes, for the parcel owner, but no for the others because they need to pay. Like in Indonesia, is it all the information available online? Yes, for me as the landowner, but no for the other person because they need to submit the request and the intention why they want to do the open data. So based on your SOLI index, I see there is a slightly label, limited, and open. How can I put that yes but no condition in that index so it doesn't create any misunderstanding on the
Okay, yeah, so I should get your details so that you can become a consultant for us when we launch the Open Up Guide, and we'll do the training of that. No, I mean it's a good point, because when you try and develop these questions, you develop them in a way that they are easy to answer, but the situation on the ground is not so easy to answer, is not so clear cut. So we try to provide some rough guidance to when we do the assessment. So for example, for it to be fully free, we take that to mean you don't need to occupy a special role to access the information. Anybody can access it. If it's partially free, it's where you start seeing different roles. So I can go onto a portal and access this amount of information. If I register on the portal and I become a registered user, I perhaps have more options for download, GeoTIFF or whatever. There might be additional information that I can download. If I am a third level user, i.e. I'm a government employee, then I have access to the full data set. Then we would describe it as partial. We also have situations where you have to pay a fee to access the data. Anybody, it can be a license fee. So for us, the assessment is about how free is the data, or how open is the data. So that's the type of guidance that we try to use. But it does require, I think, with all of these kind of assessments, a building of a competency between a group of people that are doing the assessment, having those discussions, doing the training, and identifying those issues and agreeing on how to consistently address and score those issues. So I do think it is engagement, but that is kind of a little bit the guidance that we use, and it differs from country to country. We also find situations where government officials would say, no, the data is freely available, but it's only to officials in the department, not to anybody else. So we would say, okay, that would be a little bit available because it's not at all accessible for the public, but there is, and we do think that it's important to break down those silos between government departments as well. So if more departments are sharing and have access to information, that is something that we will like to see reflected, in the scoring. I hope that answers your question.
Yes. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Aslı from Istanbul, Turkey. I work for Istanbul municipality as a city planner. And we have land data in Istanbul, but we are filling the information fields of the land data recently, on recent years. And I want to ask that you help governments to collect and share data as far as I understood, right? But do you work with local governments also, or you just look at the country level?
So when we do the assessment, we do it primarily at the national level because there's so much variation between local authorities and municipalities and the competencies that you have. But for something like, say, for example, land development data, how are development applications submitted, assessed, tracked, is that information available? We would look at a sample local authority. Typically, we would look at usually, say, the biggest one to see if that is made available. When we do the open up work, at the moment, our partners have been in the beginning national government at the national level, but then it starts boiling down to a specific department. So the Department of Land and Territorial Services or the Surveyor General's office. But we have also previously actually discussed to try and implement the guide at local authority level, where municipality, where city that is dealing with these issues at local level would be interested in applying the guide. And we've had some preliminary discussions, but we haven't had a pilot implementation at the local authority level yet. But we do think that would actually be very interesting, because also when you engage with the data ecosystem in many countries, based on the sort of decentralization structure, a lot of the resources lie at national level, but a lot of the data collection activities and initiatives happen at local authority level. And it's about also trying to have a conversation to bridge this. What do you need at local authority level? How can you aggregate that and feed data into the national system that is not too detailed, but that is relevant for the national level, and vice versa? How do you take national level planning, spatial plans, development plans for the country or for the province, and have those feed into and become the basis for your local level planning? And this is the kind of information flows that are missing, and that we would like to emphasize when we talk about open data. It's about opening those flows as well, not only a sort of internal, external perspective, but within government and within local and national government. So I think it's a very interesting question that you've raised, and something that we think also would be very interesting. Any other? Yes?
Yes. Thank you for the presentation. My questions, in the SOLI indexes, for example, is there any importance of sharing more data, for example, sharing owner names or the value and the location, or it's just about the accessibility, or if it is free, or is there any importance?
So in the assessment, we describe the type of information that is made available, but we don't strictly assess it at that level of detail. So we don't score it better because ownership, let's say the owner's name, is part of the public record. We do document that to describe the type of information, and primarily because we think that conversation about whether you make the owner's name public is a national conversation, and it's going to differ from country to country. It's going to differ from the legislative framework that we have. So we don't advocate that owner's name should be. In some countries it is, In some countries, it's not. If you go to Canada and you look on the Open Cadastral Database, the address is on there, the size of the plot is on there, the dimensions of the plot is on there, the coordinates of the plot is on there. If you go to Namibia, it's not a digital system, or the digital system is closed, but the analog information is also public record. So anybody has the right to access any information on that parcel, including the mortgage. The rationale for that comes from the perspective that land records, to maintain their integrity, needs to be public, so that if you have a mortgage on a property, you cannot hide that information and sell the property and get away from the responsibility. So mortgage information is considered a public right, and the public has a right to know. But like I said, that depends very much on the kind of legal context and framework. And there's, I think, not something that we would say that is what it must be, or that's what it shouldn't be. That's really a national conversation that needs to be had. But we do point out, look, for the services that you're trying to deliver, what kind of information and what level of information is needed? Is it only the location of the plot, the use of the plot, the type of ownership perhaps? So it's a concession, it's a lease, it's privately owned, or it's state land. That might be sufficient in some cases for planning purposes. But if you have a strong interconnected financial system that is linked to banks and property transactions in a property market, then you might want to have ownership information and mortgage information linked to that, as you do in some other countries. But it also depends on readiness. I think you can't jump from having no information to having sort of completely open. There's a learning process, there's capacity that needs to be developed to not only keep the information, but to keep it safely, to keep it securely, to respect people's rights to privacy, and finding that trade-off and that balance that is often, privacy will also be probably protected constitutionally and protected legally. And it would be remiss of us to now start going in, not understanding privacy legislation and culture in a country, to say this is what it should be. But I think what we want is exactly this kind of dialogue. What level of information should be made public? And we would like to link that to what level of services would you like to deliver, and to make the information available that is needed for the service that must be delivered. Yeah.
Maybe I'm just curious, is there any correlation between land coverage registration and the tendency of nations to open their data?
The correlation between
the land registration coverage, like
land governance legislation?
No, the coverage of registration in the country, like in Mozambique, in Namibia, with the tendency of there to open the data to the public.
We haven't researched a correlation between sort of the legislative framework and the degree of openness. So we've only looked at the data governance framework. But the presentation that Mark made yesterday afternoon, I don't know who was there, and I immediately thought, that is very interesting. I would like to look at their assessment of land governance progress, and the systems that they've described in the framework and try and map that against the degree of openness, to see if there's a correlation that maybe countries that are more open have a more mature system or are doing better. But I suspect there will not be a neat correlation, but it will still be interesting to compare and see what comes out of that.
One question is, if we think that the data is not correct enough, so there is some problem in data, so can we say that the open data is a good thing, because it can lead some problem if it's not correct?
Okay, so I think we think that the best way to improve the quality of data is to let people use it, inspect it, complain and fix it. And you find a lot of even big organizations now, when they want to improve their software or they want to improve their data, they release an alpha or beta version to the public and let the hackers work on it and do all that work for free. Because your data will never be perfect. Your data will never be good. Your data depends on the purpose for which the data is to be used. So I think from our perspective, number one, we don't assess the quality of the data in that regard. But we do believe that making the data open, even if the data is, for whatever parameter you are using, not accurate enough or of not good enough quality, we think there are other uses for which it will probably be good and that the users are best placed to decide that. But we think that that process of opening up data is actually a very important tool in improving the quality of the data and making it more fit for purpose. Because, and we encounter that a lot. We can't make our data public because there are too many mistakes. Part of it is professional pride and embarrassment. I don't want to release a product. I'm the Director General of this department. I'm now exposing myself to the public, to my supervisor, to my boss, to my head of the department that might think now I'm incompetent or I didn't do my job well enough. So these are internal issues that have to be overcome to say, well, look, opening up the data is not an assessment of the department's competency. It's really proof of the department's willingness to improve the data, to work on the data. And that means it must be accompanied by a liability statement, for example, by a license that clarifies this. So we talked about license information. When you make that data available to say, we are releasing this data, this is the purpose that we anticipate the data to be used for. We don't expect that this data can form the basis for legal boundaries. That is still the survey record, for example, that we have, so that you don't start creating false expectations of what you are releasing. So make it clear what it is being released, what you think it is good for, and what you think it is not good for, and what you are willing to be liable for, and what you are not liable for. So a government license on data, metadata on the quality of the data, so it's really just about describing the data rather than deciding what is good or what is bad, but describing what it is that is being released.
Thank you.
No problem.
Yes, I would like to ask a question. Maybe it's more to put it on more general perspective. So I see these trends on the data availability that a country goes from the phase not available and then become available. But in the end, some of the country, I think, put it as the more intricate data available, more detailed data, more accuracy data, and they put it in some kind of payments wall. What is your maybe general perspective on it? Like, is it okay, and whether it's like have effect in the openness?
You mean you put the data behind a paywall?
Yeah, like.
I mean, I think you lose an important opportunity if you do that. There's so much research that has shown that the money that is generated doesn't come from selling of data, but comes from the services that are developed on the data. In other words, the real money for the SG's office or for a country doesn't come from putting data behind a paywall and charging people for it. It really becomes data services that are developed. Everything from the guy in your town that is now using that address data to do his pizza delivery service, to set up an app to deliver food or to do home repairs, because you can do that. That's really where the value lies. I think data from Canada, from Australia, showed that oil exploration data, they started forcing even private companies that get government concessions to exploration. After 5 years, that data must now be released and made available, including to their competitors. And the industry was shocked. Like, I mean, we're giving away our competitive advantage. What happened was that within 20 years, the oil industry, now I'm not a big advocate of the oil industry, I'm using it as an example, boomed from about 20 billion to 200 billion. Because companies were now not spending their time on redoing seismic surveys that somebody else had done, and all the environmental damage that goes with that, with all the exploration, repeated exploration. But they could spend their money on innovation, on developing other parts of that sector. And that's just an example of, I think, where opening up data, getting away from paywalls, getting away from charging for the data, really can be a driver actually for innovations that we don't know yet, by private people, by individuals, by students, by researchers, by industry, who use the data to do something that we haven't thought of. And that's the driver, I think, of economies and looking to the future. So I think a lot of countries are still have the idea a little bit that data is valuable, data is important, and so we want to charge for the data. We don't want to make it, but at a national level, forget about selling the data or charging for the data. Give it away for free, and let people use it and come up with uses, bearing in mind that you still want to make sure that everybody is included, that people are not left behind, that there are no communities that are excluded or open to exploitation. But just because somebody sells their land, we don't say land shouldn't be titled, for example. There are risks with opening up information, but we think that the risks are bigger by holding information closed, because then you really allow the elites to have access to the information only. So opening up information, it doesn't completely level the playing field, but it creates a more level playing field than keeping the information closed, which really just gives power to those that have access to political links and to connections in departments. Yes, Neil.
I was just looking at probably the government that has done the most assessments of the economic value of opening data is the Ordnance Survey in the UK, and they've done a whole assessment, and so there is like a significant. I mean, probably like at least 30 million pounds or something per year in direct increase in revenue, but there's all kinds of.
Yeah, the OECD and the UK have earlier this year published quite a bit of research on the economic impacts of opening up data and quantifying the benefits. So that information is also available. And we also wrote a paper on the state of land ownership data in the revision of the chapter, the state of open data. It's quite dense, but it's very short. It's in the form of a blog, but it has a lot of references to articles on innovation and the use of data and the benefits to be derived from data, and also shows that the shift has moved really from opening up data to thinking of already the next level, the use and impact of that data. What purpose does it serve? I think 20 years ago, we had the idea of having both the data portal and the users will come. There's research that shows that 90% of data portals are underutilized. So it's not enough to put the information out there. It's a start, but it's also thinking about what do you expect can be done with it. What is the service that you want to deliver by making that information available? And I think that's an important component in the discussion.
They also talk about social value, studying the social value and environmental value of these issues. I was just thinking about, how there's that kid who used publicly available information on flights of airplanes to track all celebrities, and he's causing huge problems. Just like a different example. I mean, you could have unexpected uses of open data.
Was it yesterday or the day before? We had the lady presenting her work on Brazil, communities protecting their resources, and the focus was on oil platforms offshore and artisanal fishermen. And the government said, well, no environmental assessment is needed because these oil platforms are outside of your fishing range and you're not impacted. Then they plotted the oil tankers routes on top of that and the harbor that they go to and the number of journeys And so suddenly these lines covered everything from the coast to the oil platform, and a lot of spillage takes place. Now, this is an example of shipping information that is accessible and available, but that can be very quickly deployed by members of the community to defend their rights or to engage in a discussion with government. So yeah, it serves lots of purposes. I think I'm happy to stay here if there are more questions, but I don't think we have to stay for the hour and a half. So we've had a nice discussion for an hour. If there are any other questions, if they're not, my email is up here. I welcome engagement. I welcome, an email, drop us a line, look at the resources. I'm sure the presentations will be made available somewhere. I have some hot links in the presentation as well. And thank you for the thoughtful and interesting discussion. I really enjoyed being here with you. So thank you very much. And thank you, Marie, as well, for sharing those experiences of Mozambique with us.